What is happening to you?
The third full moon has come.
Your voice, your skin!
The gate is sealing us in.
No, we're trapped!
This is our curse.
She thought she married a wealthy prince. She did not know that on the third full moon of her marriage, her husband's skin would begin to peel like old paint, that his voice would drop into something ancient, and that the gate of the biggest compound in Enugu would lock itself from the inside. By the time Adaeze Okafor understood what she had really married into, 2 women before her were already dead, and the family had a name for what happens to brides who ask too many questions. They called it the quiet season. Stay till the end, because the way this story closes will stay with you longer than you expect. And if stories like this pull you in, tap that subscribe button now so you don't miss the next one. Adaeze was 26 years old when Chibueze Obidike first saw her selling fabric at Obete Main Market in Enugu. She was not looking for a husband. She was looking for enough profit that week to pay her younger brother's WAEC registration fee. Her mother had died 3 years earlier from a fever that the hospital in their village near Nsukka could not name properly, and her father, a retired school teacher, had grown quiet and small since then, spending his afternoons repairing other people's radios for a little extra money. Adaeze was the one who held the family together. She was known in the market for her sharp bargaining and her sharper laugh, the kind of laugh that made customers forget they had haggled her down and made them come back anyway. Chibueze did not look like a man who needed to shop for fabric himself. He came in a black Toyota Land Cruiser with tinted windows, wearing a plain white kaftan that somehow still looked like it cost more than Adaeze's entire store. He did not touch the fabric. He watched her hands as she folded George wrapper for another customer, and when the customer left, he stepped forward and said simply, "You fold cloth like someone who does not waste anything. I like that." Adaeze laughed him off. Rich men who came to Obete alone, without a driver hovering nearby, without a wife calling to ask where they were either up to something or lonely in a way that made her nervous. She told him politely that she was not selling herself along with the fabric, and he laughed, a real laugh surprised out of him, and said that was exactly the kind of answer his mother would have respected. He came back 3 days later, then 4 days after that. He never asked for her number directly. He asked about her father's health, her brother's school fees, the price of transportation from her village to the market, small questions that built into something larger than flirtation, something closer to attention. By the time he finally asked to meet her family, 2 months had passed, and Adaeze's father, watching the Land Cruiser pull up outside their modest bungalow, had already begun quietly hoping. The Obidike family was not simply rich. They were the kind of rich that older Enugu families whispered about with a mixture of admiration and unease. Their compound sat on a hill along Independence Layout, a white-walled estate with its own borehole, its own generator house, its own small chapel that nobody in the family seemed to actually use. Chibueze's mother, Lady Nkechi Obidike, ran 3 fabric export companies and sat on the board of a bank. Her late father, before he died, the family said of a heart condition, though the how of it was told in 3 slightly different versions depending on who was speaking, had built the family fortune from what people vaguely called import-export, a phrase that in Adaeze's experience usually meant nobody wanted to explain further. Her father, Pa Emeka, was cautiously thrilled. Her brother, Obina, was outright thrilled, already imagining a university education instead of a technical college. Only her aunt, her mother's younger sister, Auntie Chioma, pulled her aside after the introduction ceremony and asked a question that Adaeze would remember many months later, lying awake in a locked room, listening to something move behind a wall that should not have had space for anything to move in it. "Have you ever seen that family attend a burial?" Auntie Chioma asked. "Not a wedding, not a naming ceremony, a burial. Because I have lived in this town 40 years, and I have never once seen an Obidike lower their eyes at another person's grave." Adaeze laughed it off the way she laughed off most warnings that arrived without evidence. She was in love, or convinced enough of the feeling that the distinction did not matter. Chibueze was gentle with her in ways she had not expected from a man with that much money. He remembered that she took her tea with just a little sugar. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He asked about her mother and listened, really listened when she talked about her. The wedding was held on a Saturday in July, and it was the kind of wedding people in Enugu talked about months afterwards. 7 cows, a live band flown in from Lagos, Asoebi so elaborate that 3 tailors in the city ran out of the exact gold fabric within a week. Adaeze wore a wrapper woven with real gold thread that Lady Nkechi herself had commissioned, and when the older woman fastened the coral beads around her neck during the traditional rites, she held Adaeze's face in both hands and said something that at the time sounded like blessing and only later sounded like warning. "You will want for nothing in this house, my daughter, but you must promise me one thing. Whatever you see in this house, whatever you hear, you do not run. Running is what kills the ones who do not survive it. Staying and trusting us is what keeps you alive." Adaeze thought it was simply the strange, old-fashioned way wealthy in-laws spoke, the kind of dramatic blessing meant to sound weighty. She smiled, thanked her new mother-in-law, and did not think about it again until the first full moon of her marriage, 6 weeks later, when she woke at 2 a.m. to find her husband's side of the bed empty, and heard from somewhere deep inside the walls of the house she had already begun to think of as her own, a sound like something large exhaling. The first weeks of marriage were, by any honest account, good. Chibueze was attentive. The staff, a cook named Mama Rose, 2 house girls, a gateman called Babatunde, who rarely spoke, treated her with a deference that still embarrassed her, though she was learning to accept it as simply how things were done in a house like this. She had her own study, stocked with books she had never had money to buy before. She had a car and a driver on call, though she still preferred some mornings to take a bike to Obete just to see her old market friends and remind herself she had not become someone else entirely. But there were things, small at first, that snagged at her attention the way a loose thread snags at fabric, easy to ignore until you notice how much has already unraveled. The east wing of the house was locked, not just closed, locked with a heavy chain and padlock that looked older than the rest of the modern compound, as if it had been salvaged from somewhere else and installed with deliberate intention. When she asked Chibueze about it, he said only that it was where his late father's old study was kept, undisturbed out of respect, and that he himself rarely went in. The household staff never worked past 6 p.m. Every single one of them, without exception, left the compound before dark, driven home in the family's second car. Even Mama Rose, who Adaeze would have expected to sleep in, given how large the kitchen quarters were. When Adaeze asked why, Mama Rose only said, not unkindly, "Madam, in this house, night is not for us," and changed the subject so smoothly that Adaeze almost missed the strangeness of the answer entirely.
And Chibueze, 3 or 4 nights a week, would grow quiet after dinner, almost sedated in his stillness, and retreat to a room adjoining their bedroom that Adaeze had never been permitted inside. He called it his prayer room. He would enter around 9 p.m. and not emerge until well past midnight, and when he did emerge, he was exhausted in a way that sleep did not explain, his eyes red-rimmed, his hands trembling slightly until he had eaten something and had tea. Adaeze told herself this was simply what wealthy families were like: eccentric, private. Old money in Nigeria, she reasoned, was often tangled up with old traditions, with ancestral shrines nobody talked about openly, with rites that outsiders were not meant to witness. Her own grandmother had kept certain practices private from the church-going side of the family. Every family had its locked room, its unspoken rule, its version of "we do not discuss this." It was Lady Nkechi who first used the phrase that would haunt Adaeze for the rest of her marriage: the quiet season. It happened on Sunday lunch, 6 weeks in, when Adaeze mentioned offhand that she wanted to host her aunt and her old market friends for a small gathering the following weekend. Lady Nkechi's fork paused over her jollof rice. "Not next weekend," she said. "Next weekend is close to the quiet season. We do not entertain during the quiet season." "What is the quiet season?" Adaeze asked. Chibueze answered before his mother could, too quickly, in the tone of a man redirecting a conversation away from a cliff edge. "Just an old family tradition, a time of reflection, nothing important." He reached for her hand under the table and squeezed her, and Adaeze, still new enough to marriage to prioritize peace over persistence, let the subject go. But she began, quietly, to pay attention to the calendar the way she paid attention to fabric prices, noticing patterns, tracking cycles, the instinct of someone whose survival had once depended on knowing exactly when to buy and when to hold back. And what she noticed over the following weeks was this: the quiet season always arrived close to the full moon, always 3 days around it, the night before, the night of, and the night after. Always the staff gone before dark, always Chibueze's face growing tight and watchful, like a woman bracing for weather only she could see coming. The first full moon of Adaeze's marriage passed with nothing more than her husband's absence from their bed, and that single strange sound in the night, which she convinced herself the next morning over breakfast had been nothing but wind through the old roofing on the east wing. She did not mention it. She told herself she was imagining ghosts in a house that was simply old-fashioned and private. The second full moon was harder to explain away. She woke at nearly 3 a.m. to an empty bed, and this time followed the sound instead of burying her head under the pillow. She told herself she was only going to check that Chibueze was all right, that perhaps his prayer room ritual had left him unwell and needed water, tea, company. She was, she told herself, simply being a good wife. The corridor outside their bedroom was dark, except for a thin line of amber light beneath the door of the adjoining room. And beneath that door, low enough that she had to press her ear close to be certain she wasn't imagining it, came her husband's voice, but wrong, deeper, stretched at the edges, layered as if two voices were speaking at once, one recognizably his and one that belonged to nothing she had ever heard from a human throat. He was not screaming, he was not in obvious pain, he was chanting, low and rhythmic, in a dialect of Igbo so old and so heavily inflected with words she did not recognize that she understood maybe one word in 10. But the one phrase that repeated over and over, low and pleading, she understood perfectly. Narami kamidozia. Take it so I can fix it. Adaeze did not knock. Something in her, some old animal instinct inherited from generations of women who had learned to survive strange men and stranger houses, knew that whatever was happening behind that door was not for her to interrupt, not yet, not without more information than she currently had. She returned to bed and lay awake until dawn, and when Chibueze finally slipped in beside her around 4:30 a.m., smelling of something acrid and herbal like burnt camwood and river water, she pretended to be asleep and felt for the first time since her wedding day genuinely afraid of the man she had married. The next morning, Chibueze was unusually tender to her, almost apologetic in his attentiveness, bringing her breakfast in bed himself instead of letting the house girl do it, a small, unprecedented gesture that felt less like romance and more like guilt, Adaeze realized uneasily. "You look tired, my love," he said, watching her face carefully. "I didn't sleep well," she said, testing the water. "I thought I heard something, voices." Something flickered behind his eyes. Not surprise, she would later realize, but calculation, the particular stillness of a man deciding how much truth a lie could afford to contain. "The old pipes," he said. "This house makes strange sounds at night. My mother keeps meaning to have it looked at." It was, Adaeze understood even as he said it, the first outright lie he had ever told her. And once she recognized the shape of it, she began to notice how many other things in that house had the same shape, half-truths folded neatly around something they were built to hide. She began carefully, without announcing what she was doing, even to herself, to investigate her own marriage. She started with the staff because staff always knew more than family members wanted them to know. Mama Rose was loyal and mouth-closed, but one of the younger house girls, a 19-year-old named Ifiloma, who had only worked for the family 8 months and had not fully absorbed the culture of silence that governed the house, let something slip one afternoon while helping Adaeze sort laundry. "Madam, you are the third," Ifeoma said quietly, not looking up from folding a shirt. "Third what?" Adaeze asked. Ifeoma's hand stilled. She realized too late what she had said. "Nothing, madam. I did not mean anything." "Ifeoma, third what?" The girl's eyes darted toward the door, checking for Mama Rose. "The third madam I have known in this house to marry Oga Chibueze," she whispered. "I only came 8 months ago, but Mama Rose has been here 11 years. She told me, she did not mean to tell me, it slipped from her one night when she had taken a little wine at Christmas, that there were 2 women before you, a Miss Blessing, and before her, a Miss Uju. Both of them married into this family. Both of them are no longer here."
"Divorced?" Adaeze asked, though something in her chest already knew the word was wrong before Ifeoma shook her head. "No, madam," Ifeoma said, so quietly Adaeze had to lean in to hear. "They died, both of them, in this house, during the—" She stopped herself, glanced at the door again and finished in barely a whisper, "during the quiet season." Adaeze felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the particular vertigo of learning that the ground you have been standing on is not the ground you thought it was. "How?" she managed. "How did they die?" "I do not know, madam. Nobody knows, or nobody who knows will say. Miss Uju, they said it was her heart, very sudden, very young for a heart to feel like that. Miss Blessing," Ifeoma's voice dropped further, until Adaeze was reading her lips as much as hearing her. "Miss Blessing, they said she ran, that she tried to leave the compound during the quiet season at night, and by morning she was found at the gate, dead. They said an animal attacked her, but madam, we do not have such animals in this part of Enugu, not the kind that could do what was done to her." Before Adaeze could ask another question, the door opened and Mama Rose entered, and the temperature of the room changed instantly, the older woman's eyes moving between Adaze's pale face and Ifeoma's guilty posture, with an expression that made clear she understood exactly what conversation she had walked in on. She said nothing accusatory. She simply told Ifeoma, in a tone that broke no argument, to go check on the drying line outside. And when the girl had gone, Mama Rose turned to Adaeze with something that looked, unexpectedly, like sorrow rather than anger. "Madam, some knowledge, once you carry it, you cannot put it down again. Are you certain you want to keep carrying it?" "I am married into this family," Adaeze said, her voice shaking despite her efforts to steady it. "Mama Rose, I think I am already carrying it, whether I want to or not." Mama Rose studied her for a long moment, and something in her face softened, the weariness of 11 years of loyal service cracking just slightly under the weight of what looked like genuine concern for the young woman in front of her. "Then I will tell you one thing. And only one thing, because it is the one thing that might keep you alive if you are wise enough to use it. Whatever happens during the quiet season, madam, do not run, do not scream, and whatever you see, do not look directly at it, not at the face. Ifeoma is young. She thinks this is a story about death. It is not only a story about death. It is a story about who pays a debt and what happens to those who refuse to pay it." She would say no more, no matter how Adaeze pressed, and within the hour, Mama Rose had resumed her ordinary duties as if the conversation had never happened, as if she had not just handed a drowning woman a single cryptic piece of driftwood and then walked away. Adaeze spent the following days in a state of controlled panic, smiling through dinners, laughing at Chibueze's jokes, playing the devoted new bride, while privately cataloguing every strange detail of her marriage, like evidence for a trial only she seemed to know was happening. She began, discreetly, to research the Obidike family history, not through Chibueze or Lady Nkechi, but through her old market network, through elderly traders at Ogbete who remembered the family from decades back, through her father's old school teacher colleagues who had taught some of the Obidike's extended relatives. The picture that emerged, fragment by fragment, was this. 3 generations ago, the Obidike family was ordinary, moderately comfortable traders, nothing remarkable. Then, sometime in the early 1960s, right around independence, the family's fortunes transformed almost overnight. New land acquired, a trading empire built seemingly from nothing, wealth that outpaced every explainable business venture the family was publicly known for. And alongside that transformation, a hold trader at Ogbete told Adaeze in a hushed voice over a cup of tea, had come a rumor, one that had faded into folklore over the decades, but that the oldest generation still occasionally whispered about, that the first Obidike patriarch, a man named Oziemena, had made a pact with a river spirit near the family's ancestral land outside Awka, a spirit the old people called Idemili, offering something in exchange for the wealth that would carry his descendants for generations. What did he offer? Adaeze asked, already half certain she would not like the answer. The old trader had shrugged, the particular shrug of a person repeating a story they only half believed themselves. Different people tell it differently. Some say he offered his firstborn son's freedom to be reclaimed by the river spirit for 3 nights every full moon, as long as the wealth continued. Some say it is worse than that it is not freedom the spirit takes, but form. That the price is not service, but transformation. That whichever son carries the family's fortune forward must 3 nights each month become something other than a man to pay what was borrowed. The old woman had shaken her head, sipping her tea. Old story, my dear, old story. I do not know why you are asking about such things on your honeymoon season. You should be thinking of happier matters. Adaeze thanked her and left with her hands trembling, the pieces of a horrifying puzzle beginning, despite every rational instinct in her, to fit together with unbearable precision. A locked room, a husband who transformed his voice into something inhuman during 3 specific nights every month, a household staff who vanished before dark and spoke of the quiet season like a weather event to be endured rather than a family quirk to be explained. 2 dead brides before her, one of whom had died trying to run. She thought of confronting Chibueze directly and discarded it within minutes. If the family had successfully hidden this from 2 previous wives until their death, direct confrontation seemed unlikely to produce honesty and might instead produce exactly the kind of danger Mama Rosie's warning implied. She thought of leaving, of simply packing a bag and returning to her father's house, then remembered Miss Blessing, found at the gate, and understood with cold clarity that leaving might be exactly the wrong kind of dangerous. So she did something else instead. She began to prepare. She used her old market instincts, the same instincts that had once told her which customers were about to walk away with an unpaid balance, which fabric batches were secretly damaged beneath their folded exterior, to gather information without raising alarm. She befriended, slowly and carefully, an elderly woman named Ezine, who lived 2 compounds down from the Obidike estate, and who, it turned out, had grown up in the same ancestral village outside Awka that the Obidike family originally came from. Ezine remembered old Oziemena Obidike from her childhood, remembered the stories her own grandmother had told about the river shrine near the Obidike family land outside Awka, and remembered crucially one detail that the market trader had not known: the pact, according to the oldest version of the story Ezine's grandmother used to tell, was not permanent. It could be broken, but breaking it required something specific, a willing sacrifice, freely offered, of equal weight to what had originally been given. Wealth for wealth, or freedom for freedom, Or Ezine said this part very quietly, her old eyes fixed on Adaze's face with an intensity that made Adaze's skin prickle. Someone would have to offer to take the transformation upon themselves permanently so that the one currently bound to it could be released. But you must understand, Ezine warned, the spirit does not simply accept an offer spoken aloud. It must be offered inside the water, on the third night when the moon is at its fullest, when the boundary between what is owed and what is free is thinnest, and it must be offered by someone the spirit judges worthy, someone whose sacrifice would actually cost them something real. A stranger's offer means nothing to Idemili. Only love, real love, freely given and genuinely costly, has ever been recorded as accepted. Before Adaeze left Ezine's compound that evening, one more piece of the puzzle found her, unexpected and unasked for, the way the truest clues in any story tend to arrive. She was standing at Ezine's gate, waiting for her bike rider, when Babatunde, the Obidike family's gatesman, a quiet man who in 6 weeks of marriage had said perhaps a dozen words to her total, appeared from the shadow of the compound wall across the street, as though he had been waiting there for some time. "Madam," he said, his voice low, glancing up and down the empty street before continuing, "you are asking questions in this neighborhood. I have heard about it. I think it is time someone told you who I am before you go any further with what you are planning." Adaeze felt a chill that had nothing to do with the evening air. "Who are you, Babatunde?" "My real name is not Tunde, it is Okonkwo, and I did not come to work for the Obidike family by chance. My great-grandmother was the younger sister of a woman from the river village outside Oka, a woman my family has spoken of in whispers for 4 generations, a woman who drowned herself after a young trader named Ozomena Obidike disgraced her and abandoned her for a wealthier match. My family has watched this family from a distance for 100 years, madam. When old Ozomena's fortune first appeared from nowhere, my great-grandmother was the only person in the village who was not surprised, because she recognized exactly what a debt like that costs and exactly who was made to pay it. I took work in this house 11 years ago, not for the wages, though the wages are good. I took it so that someone from her family would finally be close enough to see the truth, in case the day ever came when a wife in this house was brave enough to want to hear it. Then help me, Adaeze said immediately, gripping his arm. Tell me anything you know that might help me survive what is coming. Babatunde's face, weathered and unreadable, softened slightly. I can tell you one thing the old traders and even Ezine's grandmother's stories do not know, because it was never spoken outside my own family. The spirit that took her, that people now call by the river's name, Idemili, though that was never truly her own name, only what she became, does not simply test a wife for sincerity. It tests her also for whether she already knows how to be discarded and still stand up straight afterwards. That is why it destroyed Miss Uju and Miss Blessing, women who came from comfort and had never once in their lives been made to feel disposable, and why it may look differently at a woman who already knows that feeling and has already survived it. Then help me, Adaeze said immediately, gripping his arm. Tell me anything you know that might help me survive what is coming. Babatunde's face, weathered and unreadable, softened slightly further. I can tell you one more thing the old traders and even Ezine's grandmother's stories do not know, because it was never spoken outside my own family. The spirit that took her, that people now call by the river's name, Idemili, though that was never truly her own name, only what she became, is not simply angry. My great-grandmother always said anger fades in 100 years if there is nothing beneath it. What does not fade is a name unspoken. She was never mourned by name in that village, madam. Her own family, ashamed of how she died, buried her memory along with her body. If you find a way to speak her true grief aloud to her, not as a bargain, not as a trade, I believe you will find something in that water that has been waiting far longer for a listener than it has been waiting for a victim. Adaeze did not sleep at all that night, turning Babatunde's words over and over, feeling the shape of her own life rearrange itself around a truth she had never thought to examine so directly. That the very things she had once resented, the years of scraping by, the small daily humiliations of being underestimated by wealthier customers, might be the exact preparation that would let her walk into that river and refuse to be washed away by it. She thought of her own mother, buried 3 years earlier, under a fever the hospital had never properly named, and understood with an ache that surprised her that she too knew something about grief that goes unspoken because no one in power ever thought it worth power work to name it properly. Perhaps that, more than courage, was the thing she would carry to the riverbank. Adaeze returned home that night with a plan beginning terrifyingly to take shape in her mind, and 3 days left before the 3rd full moon of her marriage arrived. She spent those 3 days watching her husband more closely than she had ever watched anything in her life, searching his face for the man she had married, beneath the exhaustion and fear she now recognized in him, the fear of a man trapped in something he likely never chosen for himself, inherited the way a debt is inherited, without consent, without escape. She began to understand, watching him flinch at the sight of the moon rising slightly fuller each night, that he was not her captor. He was, in his own way, as much a prisoner in that compound as she was becoming. On the 2nd night before the full moon, she finally asked him the question directly, gently, without accusation, sitting across from him on their bedroom balcony while the moon hung heavy and near full above the compound walls. Chibueze, tell me what happens to you during the quiet season. He did not deny it this time. He did not deflect. He simply looked at her for a long moment, and something in his shoulders seemed to collapse inward, the posture of a man who has been carrying a weight so long he has forgotten what it feels like to set it down, even briefly, even to confess it. If I tell you, he said quietly, you will want to run. And I need you to promise me before I say anything else that you will not run. Because the ones who ran, his voice broke slightly, Adaeze, I could not save them. I have tried twice to save the women I loved from this house, and twice I have failed, and I do not think I can survive failing a 3rd time. Tell me, Adaeze said, and reached across the small table to take his trembling hand in both of hers. I'm not going to run, Chibueze. I already know more than you think I know. I want to hear it from you now. And so, in the deepening dark of that balcony, with the almost full moon watching them both like a patient, ancient eye, Chibueze Obidike finally told his wife the truth his family had guarded for 3 generations, a truth that would within 72 hours force Adaeze to walk into a locked room she had been forbidden from entering, carrying nothing but a decision that would either free her husband forever or cost her everything she had left. If you're feeling that tension building already, that's exactly the kind of story this channel exists for. So if you haven't yet, tap subscribe now. Because what happens next at the river, under that 3rd full moon, is the part of this story people never forget. Chibueze's confession came slowly, like water finding cracks in old rock, each sentence opening the way for the next. His great-grandfather, Chibueze Obidike, had indeed made a pact with the river spirit Idemili in the year the story said, when the family had nothing but debts and a dying trade in palm oil. The spirit had offered wealth beyond anything the family could have built in 3 lifetimes, on one condition: that the firstborn son of every generation, once he took a wife, would belong partly to the river. 3 nights each month on the full moon, that son's body would be reclaimed, reshaped into something that was not fully man and not fully what the river demanded either. Something in between. Something that Chibueze himself, even after 29 years of living with it, could not fully describe because he did not remember what happened during the transformation itself. He remembered before, the pool beginning behind his eyes like a migraine that spread through his whole body. He remembered after, the ache in muscles that felt stretched beyond their ordinary shape, the taste of river water in his mouth, though he had not gone near any river. What happened in between was simply gone from him, a door his own mind would not let him open. My father lived like this, Chibueze said. His father before him. It has always been the firstborn son. It was supposed to end with wealth simply being wealth, generation after generation, forever. But 3 years ago, my father discovered something the family never knew. The pact does not renew itself automatically. It requires every generation a fresh offering at the time of the firstborn son's marriage. A blood-bound gift, my father called it, though he would never explain further what that meant. And then he died before he could explain it to me, his heart failing suddenly one night that I now believe, though I have no proof, was not natural. I believe he tried to break the pact himself, alone, without telling anyone, and it killed him instead. And the women, Adaeze said carefully, Uju, blessing. Chibueze flinched at the names and for a moment could not speak at all. The spirit does not simply take the son, he said finally, his voice raw. It watches the wife too. It tests her. During the quiet season, if she comes too close, if she sees the transformation directly, unprepared, it reacts. Uju saw me by accident in the 2nd month of our marriage. She had not been warned properly. My mother assumed there would be more time before she needed to know. Uju's heart simply stopped, the doctor said, though she was 24 years old and had no history of illness. Blessing knew more. My mother had prepared her better. But Blessing was frightened beyond what preparation could fix. And on the 3rd full moon of our marriage, she ran for the gate in the middle of the transformation. The spirit does not tolerate running during the quiet season. It has never tolerated running. She did not make it past the gate. Adaeze felt sick, but she made herself keep her voice steady because she understood, with the particular calamity of a woman who has decided something important, that falling apart now would help no one. Why has your family never tried to break it, truly break it, not just survive it generation after generation? Because breaking it requires a sacrifice my mother has never been willing to ask of anyone, a willing exchange. Someone must offer themselves at the river on the 3rd night of the full moon to take the burden permanently in the other's place, and the spirit only accepts an offering if it judges the love behind it as real, as costly. My mother offered herself once, decades ago, when my father first began struggling under the weight of it. She went to the river. The spirit refused her. Why? Because she went to save her husband's wealth as much as her husband's life, and the spirit knew the difference. It always knows the difference. It has taken every insincere offering that has ever been made to it and thrown it back like spoiled fruit. That is why my mother warns every wife of this house not to run, and also why she has never told any of you the whole truth quickly, because she has watched 2 women die from too much truth too soon, and she did not know until she watched you these past weeks whether you are someone capable of surviving the whole truth at all. Adaeze sat with that for a long moment, the moon above them now unmistakably, frighteningly close to full. Your mother made the offering for the wrong reason, she said slowly, so the spirit refused her. What is the right reason? Chibueze looked at her, and in his eyes she saw something she had not expected to find in that moment. Not fear, but a terrible, fragile hope. The hope of a drowning man who has just felt something solid brush against his hand in the dark.
I don't know, he admitted. No one has ever gotten close enough to find out. Adaeze, whatever you are thinking right now, I need you to stop thinking it. I have watched 2 women die trying to fix what should never have been theirs to fix. I will not watch a third. Then you should have married someone who gives up easily, Adaeze said. And despite everything, despite the fear sitting like a stone in her stomach, she found she meant it as something close to a joke. And Chibueze, despite everything, found himself laughing, a broken, disbelieving laugh, but a real one, the laugh of a man remembering briefly why he had fallen for this particular woman among all the women in Enugu. Over the following 2 days, Adaeze did not tell Chibueze her plan because she suspected correctly that he would try to stop her by any means necessary, including locking her in a room himself if it came to that. Instead, she went to Lady Nekechi. She found the older woman alone in the family's small, unused chapel, sitting in the front pew, not praying exactly, just sitting. The posture of a woman keeping vigil for something she had kept vigil for many years. Lady Nekechi did not seem surprised to see her. He told you, Lady Nekechi said. It was not a question. He told me, Adaeze confirmed, sitting beside her mother-in-law in the quiet, dust-mellowed light of the chapel. And I need you to tell me the rest, the part he does not know. What did you offer exactly the night the spirit refused you? I need to know precisely what went wrong if I am going to do this differently. Lady Nekechi turned to look at her then, really look at her the way a person looks at someone they are recalculating, reconsidering, seeing perhaps for the first time. You intend to go to the river. I intend to go to the river. You understand what happened to the last 2 women who tried to interfere with things they did not fully understand?
I understand that they did not know what they were interfering with, Adaeze said. I intend to know exactly. That is why I am asking you, instead of simply walking into the water blind. Something shifted in Lady Nkechi's face. Not approval exactly, but something adjacent to it, a grudging, exhausted respect. She was quiet for a long moment before she spoke again. I offered my life, she said finally. I told the river, take me instead of my husband. Let him be free. Let our son be free. And the river refused me, because underneath that offer, if I am honest with myself even now, 30 years later, there was a smaller offer I was not brave enough to say aloud, a bargain. Take me, but let the wealth remain. I wanted to save my husband and keep everything the wealth had built for us both. I was not offering a true sacrifice. I was offering a trade I still expected to profit from. The river spirit, Idemili, does not deal in trades dressed up as sacrifices. It deals only in loss that is truly loss, freely chosen, with nothing kept back. And if someone offered themselves with nothing kept back, no expectation of the wealth continuing, no expectation of even being remembered as the one who fixed it, simply loving someone enough to let everything else go, including the outcome, do you think that would be accepted? Lady Nkechi studied her for a long moment, and when she finally answered, her voice was almost too quiet to hear. I think, my daughter, that you are either about to save this family or become the 3rd name on a list I have spent 30 years praying would never need a 4th. I cannot tell you which. I have never seen anyone offer what you seem prepared to offer. I only pray, if you do this, that you understand there may be no undoing it whichever way it goes. The 3rd full moon of Adaeze's marriage rose on a Friday night, heavy and orange at first over the low hills outside Enugu, climbing pale and merciless by midnight. The household staff had gone as always before dark, the gates were shut, and at 9 o'clock, exactly as he had every full moon since their wedding, Chibueze kissed his wife on the forehead, told her he loved her, and walked toward the adjoining room he called his prayer room, not knowing that this time Adaeze had no intention of staying behind. She waited until she heard the low change in his voice begin, the first stretched notes of the chant she now recognized.
and then she moved. Not toward the locked east wing where she had assumed wrongly that the ritual took place, but toward a door in the compound's rear garden that Ezinne had told her about 2 days earlier. A narrow gate in the boundary wall that led through a stretch of overgrown bush the family maintained but never used, down to a small tributary of the Ekulu River that ran along the edge of the Obidike land. The shrine site itself, the place where old Ozomena had first struck his bargain 3 generations and 1 unbroken cycle of moons ago. The night air was thick with the smell of wet earth and something else beneath it, something mineral and old, like the inside of a cave that had never seen sunlight. Adaeze's hands shook as she pushed through the last of the bush and came out onto a narrow bank where the water moved slow and black under the full moon, and where waiting for her, not quite standing on the bank but not quite standing in the water either, was something that had once, she understood with a lurch of horror and grief both at once, been her husband. It was tall, taller than Chibueze had ever been, its skin a shifting grey-green that caught the moonlight strangely, its eyes, when it turned them toward her, still unmistakably his eyes, dark and frightened and pleading with her even now, even like this, to run. She did not run. She walked to the edge of the water, close enough that the cold of it soaked into the hem of her wrapper, and she knelt, and she spoke, not loudly, not dramatically, but with a clarity that surprised her, even her. "I understand that they did not know what they were interfering with," she said to the water, to whatever listened beneath it. "I intend to know exactly, and that is why I am asking you, instead of simply walking into the water blind." For a long, terrible moment, nothing happened. The water lay still. The creature that had been her husband did not move, its strange eyes fixed on her with an expression she could not read. And then the surface of the river began to churn, slow at first, then faster, a sound like something enormous turning over in its sleep, and the water rose, not in a wave but in a column, dark and glistening under the moon, taking a shape that was not human and perhaps had never been fully human, even in whatever ancient bargain had first given it form. The voice that came from it was not loud. It did not need to be loud to shake something loose in Adaeze's chest that felt like her ribs rearranging themselves around her heart. 3 generations have offered me wealth dressed as love. None have offered me loss dressed as nothing at all. Why do you offer me nothing, daughter of Ogbete? Because it is not nothing to me, Adaeze said, her voice steady even as tears ran freely down her face. It is everything I have. That is exactly why it counts. The water shape did not answer immediately. It simply looked at her, and looking, Adaeze understood, was perhaps the wrong word for what it did, because she felt seen in a way that had nothing to do with eyes, a scouring, total attention that seemed to move through every year of her life at once, every debt she had ever paid for her family, every sacrifice she had made quietly and without expecting thanks for it, every night she had gone hungry so her brother could eat before an exam. She felt it weighing all of it, and she understood with sudden and complete clarity that this was exactly what it had been doing to every Obidike bride for 3 generations, and that the 2 women before her had not failed because they were weak, but because their offers, however sincerely meant in the moment, still carried some small, unexamined hope of reward folded inside them, a hope of being remembered as the hero, a hope of a happy ending waiting on the other side of the sacrifice. Adaeze had none of that left in her. She had walked to that river already grieving, already certain she would not walk back the same person if she walked back at all. And it was precisely that emptied-out certainty she realized only later that the spirit had been searching for and had never before found. "You are not the first to stand where you stand," the voice said, and this time something in its tone had shifted, the fury dampened into something closer to weariness, closer strangely to grief. "Let me tell you what was actually taken, daughter of Ogbete, so that you know what you are asking to carry."
And then, in images more than words, In a flood that pressed itself directly into Adaeze's mind rather than her ears, she saw it. Not a monster's ancient grudge, but a woman's stolen life. A young woman named Idemili, no spirit at first, but flesh and blood. The daughter of a fisherman along this same river more than 100 years before Adaeze was born. She saw Chibueze Obidike as a young trader, ambitious and charming, courting Idemili with promises of marriage, taking from her family's meager stores of goodwill and labor to build his early trade, and then, once his fortunes had grown enough to attract a wealthier match, abandoning her, publicly, humiliatingly, at the very river bank where they had once met, marrying instead into a family with land and connections, leaving Idemili disgraced in a village that blamed unmarried, discarded women for their own ruin far more readily than it blamed the men who ruined them. She saw Idemili walk into this same river one night, not rescued, not transformed by any bargain of her own choosing, simply gone, swallowed by grief and water together. And she saw the river itself, ancient and old beyond any human accounting, take her sorrow and her fury and give it a shape, a way to be heard, a way to make the death visible in a world that had refused to see it while she lived. The wealth Chibueze built afterward, the vision showed her, had not been a gift the spirit offered freely. It had been extracted, forced from the man's own guilt made manifest, a curse he had mistaken and later marketed to his own descendants as a blessing, a bargain he claimed to have struck, when in truth he had simply been made to pay, slowly and across generations, for a woman's stolen dignity that he had never once, in his own lifetime, found the courage to name aloud or make right. The debt was never wealth for transformation, the voice said, quieter now, almost sorrowful. The debt was dignity for dignity. A woman was made invisible, her suffering unspoken, her name erased from the very fortune built on her ruin. Every bride who came after was tested for the same thing Chibueze never gave me, to be seen, truly seen, and to be named, truly named, by someone who owed her nothing and offered her everything anyway. Adaeze understood then, with the force of something clicking irreversibly into place, exactly what the river had been waiting for 3 generations, through 2 dead brides and 1 refused mother-in-law, and 100 years of quiet, ritualized suffering passed down like an heirloom nobody had bothered to examine closely enough to recognize as grief. It did not want a body. It did not want a life traded for a life. It wanted to stop being erased. Idemili, Adaeze said, and saying the name aloud into the dark felt like setting something down that she had not known she was carrying. Your name was Idemili, and what was done to you was wrong, and it was never your fault, and I am sorry that it took 100 years and 3 dead women for anyone in this family to finally say so. You are not a debt. You are never a debt. You are a woman who deserved better than what my husband's great-grandfather gave you, and I will not let this family keep pretending that your name is just the name of a spirit to be managed and appeased. I will say it. I will make my husband say it. I will make sure every child born into this family after tonight knows exactly who Idemili was and what was done to her and why. That is what I am offering you. Not my body, not my life traded for his. Your name spoken honestly for as long as this family exists. If that is not enough, then take what you are going to take tonight, and I will not run from it. But I do not think it was ever wealth or blood you wanted. I think it was simply this. The column of water hung suspended for a long moment that felt like the entire night holding its breath alongside her. And then, slowly, it began to lower, not violently, not vanishing all at once, but settling, the way anger settles when it has finally, after a very long time, been heard rather than merely survived. It is enough, the voice said, and for the first time it sounded almost young, almost like the girl she had been 100 years before the river took her. But understand, daughter of Obete, I will not give back what was never mine to give. The wealth this family has built on my silence, I will not let continue to grow from it. That part of the bargain ends tonight, whether you ask for it to end or not. Your husband will be free of the transformation. The money will not long survive his freedom. This is not punishment. This is simply what happens when a debt is named honestly instead of paid in silence. The fortune was never real. It was only ever borrowed grief, wearing the shape of gold. The water fell. The shape that had been rising above the river collapsed back into the current with a sound like a long exhale, and where the transformed body of Chibuike had stood at the edge of the bank, there was now simply Chibuike himself, on his knees in the mud, gasping, weeping, alive in a way that Adaeze understood. Watching him meant something different now than it had meant an hour ago. She ran to him, really ran, for the first time that night, and held him while he shook, while the last of whatever the river had put into his body for 29 years worked its way out of him in violent, racking sobs that sounded to Adaeze's ears exactly like a man grieving a version of himself he had never been permitted to know. They did not speak of what happened until they were back inside the compound walls. Wrapped in blankets, Lady Nkechi standing at the kitchen door with her hand pressed hard against her mouth, having clearly run the moment she heard the commotion, her eyes moving between her son's ordinary, unremarkable human face and her daughter-in-law's mud-streaked wrapper with an expression that broke, finally, fully, into tears she likely been rationing for 30 years. The weeks that followed were not, contrary to what a simpler story might have promised, weeks of uncomplicated joy. The river spirit had kept its word in both directions. Chibuike never transformed again. The quiet season, for the first time in 3 generations, passed uneventfully, the full moon simply a moon, nothing waiting behind any locked door. But within 2 months, the family's fortunes began, unmistakably, to unravel. Contracts that had always mysteriously come through began to fall apart at the final stage. Business partners who had never questioned the family's opaque import-export success now suddenly found reasons to delay, to renegotiate, to walk away entirely. Lady Nkechi's export companies lost in quick succession 3 major shipping arrangements that had underpinned the family's cash flow for over a decade. It was not sudden ruin, not overnight collapse into poverty, but it was indeed the slow and steady draining of something that had never, in the spirit's own words, been real to begin with. Some members of the extended family were furious. An uncle Adaeze had met only twice at the wedding accused her openly at a tense family meeting 3 months after that night at the river of destroying generations of hard work for the sake of a story an old woman at Obete market probably invented to sell more tea. Lady Nkechi, to Adaeze's quiet astonishment, was the one who silenced him.
Hard work, Lady Nkechi said, her voice cutting and final in a way Adaeze had never heard her use before, is not the word for what built this family's first fortune. I have known that for 30 years and said nothing, because saying nothing was easier and because the money made the silence comfortable. My daughter-in-law said something I was too afraid to say for 3 decades. If the cost of that honesty is this house, then this house was always more expensive than we understood. I would rather be poor and able to look at my grandchildren without flinching than rich and unable to explain to them where any of it truly came from. The compound on the hill was sold within the year, not seized, not lost to scandal, simply sold, quietly, to cover debts that surfaced once the money that had always mysteriously appeared to cover them stopped appearing. Chibueze and Adaeze moved into a modest 3-bedroom house in a much less prestigious part of Enugu, the kind of house Adaeze's own father might once have dreamed of for her daughter without ever quite believing it possible.
Chibueze, freed of a burden that had shaped every relationship he had ever tried to build, threw himself first into confusion and grief over an identity he no longer fully recognized, and then slowly into something that looked almost like relief. The relief of a man discovering that his own hands, without any inherited magic behind them, were still capable of building something honest, even if it was smaller. He took work at a mid-sized trading company, starting well below where his family name would have once placed him, and found to his own quiet surprise that he did not mind starting there. Adaeze went back to Ogbete Market, not out of necessity exactly, though the family's new circumstances made her income useful, but because she had missed the particular dignity of her own hands doing work she understood completely without any locked doors or unspoken rules attached to it. Her old customers welcomed her back with the same sharp affection they had always shown her, teasing her gently about the fabric on her old wedding day. And Adaeze found that she laughed easily again, in a way she had not quite managed during the wealthy months, when every laugh carried a small, unexamined weight of things she did not yet know to be afraid of. Lady Nkechi, in the years that followed, became something Adaeze had never expected. Not simply a mother-in-law tolerated out of obligation, but something closer to an ally, even a friend. The two women bound by a night at a riverbank that no one else in the family, not even Chibueze, could fully understand from the outside. It was Lady Nkechi's idea, a year after the compound was sold, to commission a modest plaque, nothing grand, to be placed quietly at the site of the old family shrine on what remained of the ancestral land outside Awuka. A plaque bearing a single name, and beneath it a short inscription that Adaeze herself had written, Idemili, daughter of the river, wronged and finally named. May every generation after this one remember her honestly. It did not undo what had happened to her. Nothing could undo that. But Adaeze had learned standing at that riverbank on the night that changed everything, that some debts are not paid by pretending the ledger was never opened. They are paid slowly and imperfectly by finally writing the truth down where it can be read. She thought sometimes in the quiet, uncomplicated evenings of her much smaller house about the two women who had come before her. Uju, who had never been given the chance to understand what she had married into, and Blessing, who had understood just enough to be terrified and not enough to know there was any other way through the fear but running. Adaeze did not think of herself as braver than either of them. She thought of herself as luckier to have arrived third after the family had already begun, however reluctantly, to loosen its grip on its own silence, luckier to have found an old woman at a market store willing to tell an old story instead of dismissing it, luckier to have loved a man capable of confessing an unbearable truth instead of protecting it at any cost, even hers. She still went to the river sometimes alone in the early evening before the moon rose, not out of fear anymore, but out of something closer to habit, the way a person visits a grave not because they expect an answer, but because the visiting itself means something. She would sit on the bank, dip her fingers into water that had once risen taller than any man and spoken with 100 years of grief folded into its voice, and she would simply say the name, quietly, the way you might greet an old friend, Idemili. The water never answered again, not in words, not in visions, not in anything Adaeze could have described to another living person without sounding, even to her own ears, slightly unwell. But sometimes on those quiet evenings, a small current would move against the flow of the river, gentle and deliberate, brushing once against her fingers before continuing on its way. And Adaeze chose every time to believe that this was an answer of its own kind. Not wealth, not magic, not the return of anything that had been taken, simply the smallest possible acknowledgement that somewhere in the long, quiet current of that river, a woman who had spent 100 years unnamed had finally been heard. The Obidike family that exists today is smaller, plainer, and by every material measure, far less impressive than the one Adaeze married into on that gold-threaded wedding day. But it is also for the first time in 3 generations, a family with nothing locked behind any door, nothing whispered about on Sunday lunch, nothing that requires the staff to vanish before sundown 3 nights a month.
Chibueze and Adaeze's own daughter, born 2 years after that night at the river, will grow up knowing the full story of where her family came from, not as a shameful secret to be managed, but as a history to be understood, a debt that was finally paid not in gold and not in blood, but in the one currency it turned out the river had been waiting 100 years for someone to offer. Babatunde, Okonko, as Adaeze now called him whenever they spoke privately, stayed on with the family even after the compound was sold, following them at his own quiet insistence into the smaller house, taking on odd work around the new, humbler property that no longer required a gateman at all. When Adaeze asked him once, gently, why he had stayed when his family's long watch over the Obidikes had, by any reasonable measure, finally come to an end, he had simply shrugged and said that a man who spends 40 years watching for the moment a debt gets paid does not easily walk away the week it finally happens. He wanted to see what an honest version of this family looked like, having spent so long only ever seeing the dishonest one. Adaeze's father, Payameka, took the news of the family's fallen fortune with far less distress than anyone had expected. He had never fully trusted wealth that arrived without a story he could follow from beginning to end, and when Adaeze finally told him the truth, not all at once, but slowly, over several visits, testing how much he could hold before deciding he could hold all of it, he had simply nodded, unsurprised in the particular way of a man who has spent a long life watching money behave strangely in other people's hands, and told her that he was prouder of her for what she had done at that riverbank than he had ever been on her wedding day, gold thread and 7 cows included. Her brother Obina, for his cat, still finished his education, though on a more modest scholarship Adaeze helped him secure, rather than on Obidike money, and he liked to tell people, only half joking, that his sister had once talked a river spirit to a peace treaty, which was, he said, a far better story to tell at parties than simply having a rich brother-in-law.
The plaque at the old shrine site outside Olka still stands today, small and unremarkable to anyone passing who does not know its story. Weathered now by several rainy seasons, the lettering softened but still legible. Local children sometimes ask their elders about the name on it, and the answer they receive, increasingly, is not a whispered warning to stay away from the water after dark, but a full story, told properly, of a young woman named Idemili who was wronged, and of a young bride named Adaeze who, 100 years later, finally said so out loud where it could not be unsaid again. That, in the end, is the real inheritance Adaeze left her own daughter, not the compound on the hill, which was never truly theirs to keep, and not a fortune built on a century of managed silence, but the plainer, harder, more durable inheritance of a family that had finally learned to tell the truth about where it came from, even when the truth cost everything it thought it could not live without. The truth, spoken honestly, by someone who owed nothing and gave everything anyway. If this story moved you the way it moved us to tell it, you already know what to do. Hit subscribe, because the next story is already waiting, and trust me, you do not want to miss how it begins. Until then, take care of yourselves, and remember, some debts are never really about money at all.